Well, hello and welcome to this New Zealand Initiative webinar. My name is Oliver Hartwich. I'm the Executive Director here at the initiative, and it's my pleasure to introduce my colleague, Matthew Birchall, the author of the report we're launching today. Matthew has just produced his report, Driving Change: How Road Pricing Can Improve Our Roads. The ideas in the report are not precisely new, because actually, as Matthew will tell us, and he's a historian by background, the first person that we could find who ever wrote about road pricing was Adam Smith in 1776. But no one has quite cracked that nut of how to introduce it properly, at least not in New Zealand. And this is what Matthew's new report is all about. So based on an ancient idea by modern standards, he is actually explaining in this new report how we could finally bring comprehensive nationwide road pricing to New Zealand. Many of you will know Matthew, of course, from his previous report, where he wrote about the history of infrastructure. And as I mentioned, he's a historian, so he has a very good grasp of where we've come from in all of these infrastructure discussions and how we can then hopefully lead them to a much better future on road pricing, because we think this is clearly and absolutely an idea whose time has come. It is time to move forward towards road pricing because we all want a better functioning transport system. That's what the report is about. And with that, I'll lead you over to Matthew Birchall. Please, Matthew, tell us, what is your report all about and what are you proposing?
Great. Thank you, Oliver. Just give me one moment to set up the slide. It's a real pleasure to be with you this afternoon to talk about how we can create a better transport system for all New Zealanders. Our roads are the lifeblood of our economy and society. Getting from A to B matters, but our current approach is falling short. Let's start with how New Zealand funds its roads. Since the 1920s, Kiwis have paid fuel tax to maintain the country's road network. When you fill up your car today, nearly $1 per litre goes to the government. However, we charge drivers the same rate regardless of when or where they drive. And this creates a mismatch between the cost of roads and how we use them. And the consequences are evident in our daily lives. We find ourselves sitting in traffic jams, reminiscent of queues in centrally planned economies. Our scarce road space is used inefficiently, leading to congestion that wastes both time and resources. In essence, we're dealing with scarcity in a counterproductive way. We pay a high price through taxes, yet still ration road use through queues. And this approach gives us the worst of both worlds: high costs and poor results. But there's a better way, and it's an idea with a surprisingly long pedigree, as Oliver has alluded to. Adam Smith, in his famous book, The Wealth of Nations, 1776, introduced what we now call the user pays principle. He argued that those who benefit from infrastructure should bear the cost of its construction and maintenance. Now, from horse-drawn carriages to electric cars, the ways we travel have obviously changed dramatically. But Smith's core principle that users should pay for the roads they use remains as relevant as ever. But road pricing isn't just a theory, it's transforming cities around the world. Singapore has led the way. Since 1975, they've fine-tuned road pricing to keep traffic flowing in one of the world's most dense cities. And importantly, their focus has been managing congestion, not raising revenue. The other international example that I absolutely love is Stockholm. Initially met with skepticism, their congestion charge now enjoys strong public support. And the results speak for themselves. Traffic into the city centre has dropped by around 20%, significantly reducing travel times and emissions. These real-world examples offer valuable lessons for New Zealand. Now, while there's no one-size-fits-all approach, successful road pricing schemes share common features: clear objectives, robust public engagement, and a commitment to improving efficiency rather than revenue generation. This brings us to SmartRuck, a practical approach to road pricing for New Zealand that draws on international experiences while addressing our specific needs. SmartRUC, which stands for Smart Road User Charges, is a system designed to replace our current fuel tax model with distance-based charging for all vehicles. Under SmartRUC, drivers would be charged based on 4 key factors. 1, the distance they travel. 2, the time of day they're on the road. 3, their location. And 4, the type of vehicle they're driving. This nuanced approach allows us to more accurately allocate the costs of road use and maintenance. It's a smarter, more efficient way to fund our transport infrastructure. So how would SmartRUC work in practice? The system offers 2 main options for road users. First, there's an automated pay-as-you-go system. This uses an electronic distance recorder in your vehicle to measure your road use. You'd receive regular bills, much like you do for electricity or internet, based on your actual driving patterns. The second option allows you to pre-purchase distance licenses, where you pay in advance for the distance you expect to travel. And this is similar to what many trucks and diesel vehicles do currently. This flexibility ensures that SmartRUC can accommodate different preferences and needs across our diverse population of road users. But how do we actually make SmartRUC happen? Well, it's not about flipping a switch overnight. Instead, the plan is to roll it out in stages. This gradual approach offers several key advantages. Firstly, it helps avoid the risks associated with a sudden, all-at-once change. And lessons from abroad, like Germany's rush technology rollout, show that a more measured approach is often more successful. Secondly, it allows for capacity building over time. New Zealand's entire vehicle fleet, over 4 million vehicles, can't transition overnight. So a phased approach gives everyone, from government agencies to individual drivers, time to adapt. And thirdly, it helps maintain revenue neutrality, gradually replacing the fuel excise duty with road user charges ensures a smooth transition without disrupting transport funding. This balanced, step-by-step approach paves the way for a seamless implementation of a comprehensive road user charging system. Now, you might be wondering why all this change? And simply put, it has become increasingly clear that our current system is no longer fit for purpose. And in particular, it fails to address the fundamental problem of scarcity that I discussed earlier. SmartRUC offers key benefits that tackle this issue head on. Number 1 is improved network performance. Demand-based pricing helps manage traffic flow and significantly reduce congestion. Number 2, fair, stable funding. You pay for what you use, directly linking road usage to maintenance costs. Number 3, smarter investment decisions. Insights from actual road use help guide targeted infrastructure improvements. Do we need that extra tunnel? Do we need those extra lanes? And 4, personalized insurance options. As we gather more data on individual driving patterns, insurers can offer tailored policies that better reflect each driver's actual risk profile. These benefits show that SmartRUC isn't just about changing how we pay for roads, it's about creating a more efficient and responsive transport network. Now, of course, any significant reform or change raises questions and concerns, and SmartRUC is no exception. People worry about fairness, they worry about privacy, technological feasibility, and whether this is just another tax. Will I have to pay more? These are all important issues that deserve serious consideration, and the full report explores each of these concerns in depth. And I'm happy to discuss any of these points in more detail during the Q&A. But the key point to remember is this. While these challenges are real, they are not insurmountable. SmartRUC aims to create a fairer, more efficient system, not to increase costs for drivers. It's designed to address challenges our current approach simply cannot solve. It's time for a gear change in how we approach transport funding. Road pricing has strong intellectual foundations and a track record of international success. SmartRuck offers a template for New Zealand to build on these proven principles. The challenge now is not technical, but political. New Zealand's current land transport policies have us on a road to nowhere. Implementing a more robust road pricing system can help us change course and build a network that benefits everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. We now have time for Q&A, and you can see the Slido number behind Matthew. It's 6528141. It's very simple. You go to slido.com and you type in your question, and you can also vote on other people's questions, and then hopefully we'll have a good discussion. We already have the first couple of questions, or actually 3 questions now lined up, and I'll start with the most popular one right now. How do you think replacing fuel taxes with SmartRuck will affect the way people drive?
Well, the first thing that it does is it brings prices into the system. And so currently that's not the case. So in terms of your travel patterns, it's not, where you drive or when you drive, you're not having to think as carefully as you would about those concerns if you had to pay a different charge. So it brings that level of granularity into the picture.
Okay, in which case, let's ask the next one. SmartRuck implementation comes with huge privacy concerns. People don't want to be GPS tracked everywhere they go. How would this be addressed?
Yep, so privacy is a top priority in the proposed SmartRuck system, and it's designed with robust safeguards in mind, including data minimization, anonymization, and strict access controls. So only the information for calculating charges would be collected, and it would be protected by stringent security measures. And here it's probably also worth noting that our current eRuck system already has very good privacy safeguards in place. Singapore has a model that is very good on this as well. And so it's just a matter of scaling that up. But yeah, privacy needs to be baked in from the start.
I always find that a bit ironic, actually. The people complaining about privacy are the ones probably carrying 10 different store cards in their wallets, and they also have mobile phones and tablets, and with that, they're tracked automatically anyway. So actually, perhaps it's time to just tell people this is nothing completely new. You are being tracked, you are being monitored, and actually, if you're concerned about privacy issues with SmartRuck, well, actually, can be handled, and we're handling it in other areas as well.
Yeah, correct. I mean, that's the public communications dilemma of this. We live in a digital world. Our data is used for all sorts of purposes. So Mark Zuckerberg knows far more about me than I'd probably want him to know, but that's just the reality. And so the question for public policy analysts is how do you use this data in a beneficial way? But because it's such a sensitive topic, I think you need to approach it with that level of humility and care.
Okay. Now let's talk about actually how the SmartRuck system would work. One question here is, how would this actually improve congestion? Can you explain this in simple terms?
Sure. So a key component of SmartRuck would be congestion charging. The government is very keen on this, and I think it's high time that we've implemented it. Predominantly in our major cities. So Auckland is the most obvious example, Wellington, but also Tauranga. At the moment, because we don't put a price on roads in the appropriate way, we get a lot of traffic, say at peak hours, right? You put a congestion charge during those times, you incentivize people to make different decisions. And the really interesting thing around congestion charging is it's really a battle around the margins. So it's that 5 to 10% of people who maybe taking trips now but don't necessarily have to. But all of a sudden, when you put a cost on that decision, they decide, oh, okay, maybe I'll go a little bit later, or I'll catch an alternative form of transport. So it's using price signals to manage demand.
And actually, you don't need to have much of a change when you're getting towards capacity with roads. Just changing the behavior of maybe 5 or 10% of motorists will have a dramatic effect on average speeds.
Correct. Yeah.
Now, you already alluded to it, but someone's asking here quite directly, what do you think are the biggest challenges implementing smart RUC in New Zealand? If I understand you correctly, it's not a technical problem. This can be done. It has been done elsewhere. It's a political one.
hmm Yeah, it's the public battle. It's the political battle. It's a big change, and big change scares people. We've had a fuel tax in New Zealand since the 1920s, so over 100 years, and so I see the challenge for implementing a system like Smart Ruck. That comes from the top. It comes from the Minister of Transport.
But every other country would have faced the similar kind of challenge, actually, because nobody likes to have any new taxes or fees being introduced. What's the experience from these other countries? How did they handle that public resistance?
Yeah, so Stockholm is the great example here. Um, there's huge resistance early on to congestion charging, and it actually increases right up to the point of adoption. It's only after Stockholmers see roads are flowing better that public approval starts to increase, and they vote in a referendum to keep it. The key there is you've got to get your public communications right. You've got to show people this is not about, grabbing extra money. It's not revenue gathering. It's about helping people get from A to B better, and people will respond to what they see. When they're going to work, all of a sudden they have a reliable trip time. They can get to where they need to go, and so that's the challenge is getting the communication strategy right from the beginning to emphasize the benefits.
So, as you mentioned, it's clear this scheme should be fiscally neutral. You don't want to raise any additional taxes. You basically just want to raise the taxes differently. But the question here is, can road pricing really advance then when it's dependent on ministers of parliament or parliament actually to set prices? How can a politically driven system set appropriate prices?
Yep, that's a fantastic question, and it's gets to the heart of a number of problems with our transport system. It's too politicized. If you're going to bring in road pricing, I think it has to be revenue neutral. It's about shifting how you pay. Um, but you can't bring that in and say all of a sudden you're going to be paying much, much more. But lurking in the background is, well, who is deciding what the appropriate rate is? In the report, I indicate that in the medium to long term, I'd like to see a shift away from the minister setting the rates for road user charges to an independent body. That seems like a more sustainable way to go about this, and takes the politics out of transport funding.
That leads us straight to the next question here. Someone's asking whether the scheme could be implemented by NZTA. So the way I understand you, you would like to take it out of that, and at least the determination of fees in the future would be done by a different body.
Yeah, correct. So you would have an independent body, public road company. They would liaise, they would set the ruck rates, and they would liaise directly between the road users and the ruck providers, the private providers. So the likes of your e-road. That seems like a more sensible model. And then Waka Kotahi is setting the general framework, ensuring that compliance and privacy and all these considerations are taken into account.
Okay. Another question here is what would be exempted? Mass transport, ambulances, police, probably fire trucks. I mean, can the list be kept sufficiently short? I would actually ask, do we need to exempt anything? Because currently they all pay, of course, fuel duty.
Yeah, I mean, London is a great example here, where I think it's about 50% of road users are exempt, and that's one of the problems that they have with their system. So I think we need to be really clear about no, this is a universal system. As soon as you start giving one carve out, it's very easy to give another. So I think, yeah, you have to be quite clear that this applies to all vehicles.
I think the additional problem with London was actually every time they want to increase the original congestion charge zone, that meant you got more people living inside the new extended zone, and therefore they were all residents and they all had access to preferential rates.
Yeah, yeah.
And that probably made the problem even worse. What happens when there is no alternative to private transport? That means when there are no buses, no light rail, no nothing, people actually have to use their cars. Would you then have an exception for that?
If there's no alternative, so
When people are forced to use their private vehicles, um, you would still force them to participate in the scheme.
yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say it's you're forcing people to use the scheme.
Just in the same way they're currently forced to pay for the excise.
Yeah, like you have to pay for the road somehow. So at the moment, you have to, you're not necessarily forced to pay for fuel tax, but you have to pay fuel tax. So it's just switching how you pay for it.
Okay. Um, in a similar kind of vein, there's a question about city-based congestion pricing clearly making sense in places like Auckland, heavily congested, large city. But what's the point of pricing a pensioner in Gore driving to the supermarket?
Well, their prices would probably be quite low. And that's the point is it's more flexible. Our current setup is standard across the board. So, in our major cities like Auckland and Wellington, if you're going in at peak time to get into the office, you'll likely pay more for that. But if you are this pensioner in Gore, the charge that you pay will be lower.
Although it constantly surprises me how much traffic you can create even in the smallest of places without proper traffic management. So I think
Mhm.
it's not just a big city problem in there, it's most pronounced, but I think we've got similar problems, perhaps on a slightly different level, but elsewhere too.
Yeah, correct. And I think that's one of the advantages of the system is it's adaptable, right? So it adapts to traffic patterns in real time.
Hmm. What are your thoughts on using alternative technology, so license plate recognition or traditional toll infrastructure?
I think the system that I've put forward is GPS based.
Mhm.
I think in the long term that is the most efficient way to run the system. Um, but in terms of license place technology, there's probably a case to be made there for toll roads. I don't have any sort of firm views on this. That's something for the minister and the Ministry of Transport to really nail down the nuts and bolts of this. So fairly technology agnostic, but I think the future is definitely towards the GPS model.
And it's not just a future, it's already in existence in other countries. So there are countries, I mean, Singapore, obviously using that technology. And the cost of these onboard units, if you remind me again, I think it's somewhere just above $100. So it's not actually
Yeah,
beautifully expensive or novel, it's already there.
correct, and rapidly coming down all the time. So maybe 10 years ago, the costs would have been prohibitive. But when you speak to people in the industry, the challenge is not the cost of the devices, it's scaling up to a national system. And that sort of ties back into that phased implementation.
Mhm. Got a question here. The proposal suggests that historic use will inform future use. Is this appropriate, especially given comments about central planning political systems? Is that actually correct? Do you think that historic usage patterns actually on our network will inform future decisions on pricing?
Well, the first thing I'd say, and I would say this as a historian, is the past is all we have. Um, it's a good basis in which to ground decisions, but we need to have a system that adapts very quickly and is responsive to travel patterns. The alternative, to my mind, is that we just make this up. We decide how we'd like people to travel rather than based on what they're actually doing.
Yeah, but the thing is, you would be collecting enormous amounts of data on a daily basis, really, with that new system. So you would have daily, almost real-time data, which could inform your decisions actually on how you want to invest in future transport infrastructure, for example.
Correct, and you'd be able to isolate very quickly changes in travel behavior, for instance.
Actually, let's talk a bit about the data issue, because you argue in the report that you could actually use the data for other purposes too.
Yep.
Could you talk a bit about that too?
Yeah, so the big one there is insurance. And when I was writing this report, I wanted to sort of offer not a gift, but a nice sort of add-on. What's something that this system could do that our current setup doesn't allow for? And insurance came to my mind here because you're generating all this information about how people are using the roads, and it seemed to me that that could be really valuable information in terms of insurance products for drivers because currently we have quite a generic system for insurance. And to use that example of the pensioner in Gore, maybe they're not really driving a lot. There's not huge congestion where they're going, quite sort of safe drivers. There's scope for them to have an individualized insurance policy where they're paying a lower premium than someone who, is in a big city and is sort of hooning around all the time.
Well, since you just mentioned different experiences in different parts of the country, we've got a question about that actually. Someone's asking here, local demand management solutions, so congestion charging in cities, for example, are very different to national revenue raising schemes. Shouldn't these issues actually be logically separated?
Um, yes, but I think, you know, the local solutions there complement the national road pricing scheme. So you can untangle them, but I see them as working together. Um, so, say a congestion charge in Tauranga, that's responding to local interests and local problems. And that's entirely appropriate. And at the initiative, we're all about localism and those sorts of approaches. But I see that sort of nested in a national road pricing scheme.
Okay, next question, popular question right now, is asking you to think around a few corners. So if a price reduces road demand and congestion, could authorities then conclude that road capacity is excessive and repurpose lanes, leading to then higher charges? Interesting question.
Can you repeat that? That is interesting.
Well, just saying there is road demand and congestion. Authorities are now charging a higher price for using that road. Then demand drops, and the authorities conclude, hey, no, we've got some extra congestion. Let's convert one of the lanes into a bus lane, for example. We don't need it anymore. Do you see that kind of behavior
Yeah,
playing out
yeah.
potentially?
So that gets to the point around making smarter investment decisions. We're getting feedback from how road users actually use the network, and so we can respond to that in the most efficient way possible. The other example that is a little bit akin to this that I've chatted with Eric about is, well, if you want to figure out, do you need a second basin reserve tunnel? Well, let's put a congestion charge on the one we've got already. And if we can't clear the traffic with a reasonable congestion charge, then there's probably a good case to go and build a new tunnel, toll it. If not, then we don't have to spend all that money on a new piece of infrastructure. So it gives you choices.
Mhm. It's another question I really love, probably posed by an economist. Congestion charging. Are people not already paying for congestion through the time spent? And are they not already incentivized to change behavior? And it's a good way of thinking about it because not everything that you pay for is actually a monetary price. Sometimes you just pay with the time you spend.
Yeah, I mean, that's correct. And it's one of the problems with our current system is that we do pay for congestion by idling in traffic. The problem is it's not necessarily as clear as it could be. And so sending better price signals to users. So using a very specific congestion charge, for instance, pricing the road network makes that more explicit. And it also reduces the chances that you will be stuck in traffic doing nothing.
And sometimes people really respond to incentives, and even if it's just $1.50,
Yeah,
if you've got the choice and you don't have to travel at that time and you can travel 5 minutes early and you save the $1.50, some people will just need that little bit of a nudge to actually change that
yeah,
behavior.
yeah, that's right.
Okay, how significant would be the opportunity to leverage this funding stream in order to improve our transport infrastructure dramatically and rapidly? That's a tricky question because actually what you say is you want to keep this revenue neutral. So it's not about raising extra revenue to improve any infrastructure spend, is it?
No, so that's a broader question around the structure of our transport system. So I focus very specifically in this report on how we're paying, so the revenue stream. There's another report there in terms of the decisions that we're making, things like project selection, what's how much do we want to be spending, how much do we need to be spending on our transport system. But that's very much a off to one side. This is about what source of revenue are we using to pay for our roads.
Okay. Next question from Scott Wilson. What do you think should be the next step for the government? Well, that's a broad question.
It is, and it's nice to hear a question from Scott. I think the next step, and it's been um, earmarked pretty clearly, is congestion charging. And for those of you who haven't read the report yet, it has just come out. I've been very clear in terms of how I've structured it, where I look at once I've gone through the history and the concept of road pricing, I drill into tolling and congestion charging, and I see this as the sort of immediate wins that the government can get. They're proven around the world, very effective, and the complexity of tolling and congestion charging is much less than the more ambitious smart ruck scheme, which I would see as coming after baking in congestion charging, more use of tolls. So I would focus on congestion charging, get that right, and show to the New Zealand public that road pricing can work.
How important do you think will it be to establish some kind of bipartisan consensus on this? Because actually, if you think back 6 years ago, we were very much at the same point we are today. We had a new government. The then Minister of Transport, Phil Twyford, actually said he believed in congestion charging and road user charging, and he wanted to introduce such a scheme. And then nothing happened because it was just too hard and the whole thing got stuck and there was public opposition. And in a way, that seems to be a cycle that repeats itself endlessly. Isn't that exactly the kind of problem that Simeon Brown, as the new transport minister, will encounter now?
That's right. I mean, it would be lovely to have bipartisan support for any area of public policy. It is there for congestion charging. Um, and I think hooking back to my previous answer, I think that's where you want to start in a sort of incremental fashion. Get the congestion charging right, show how it works, have all parties on board. The previous Minister of Transport, Michael Wood, had done a lot of work in this area. So it's not as though, they can't get on board. But that's a question of political management.
Hmm. We do have another question on privacy, and it is how do you square privacy concerns and data minimization with private companies having access to that information, particularly should insurance become mandatory?
I don't necessarily see it that way. Going back to what we were talking about earlier, Oliver, I mean, yes, there are challenges, but we're contracting with our data all the time. That's just the world that we live in. I think the important thing is to get the really robust principles. So that's Waka Kotahi's job to lay this out very clearly, to have the framework for private operators to negotiate and handle individual drivers' privacy. But we already have a ERUC system, and there are privacy safeguards in place, and these private companies take it very, very seriously.
Hmm. Next question. I live in Tauranga. Empty buses and bus lanes. They should be T2 lanes, and that alone would relieve a lot of congestion for no effort and encourage carpooling. Any thoughts?
I decided not to go into public transport for this report, just because I'd get stuck in a minefield of other questions and concerns, and it quickly becomes quite ideological. So I really just wanted to focus very specifically on road user charges. Now, with the system that I've outlined, it does incentivize people to make choices that best suit their needs. So there will be people that will, want to hop on a bus, hop on a train, and we'll be able to establish in real time what those changes are and where we need to channel an investment. So, in some instances, it will be clear that there needs to be an increase in investment. Other cases, maybe less. But I really wanted to focus specifically on road user charges, not public transport.
Okay. We have a question about the interaction of your policy proposal with climate change. And the question is, why would people drive less if road user charging is replacing fuel excise duty? Will this encourage purchases of less fuel efficient cars?
The proposal here um, is not about fundamentally, changing how people um, or the sort of how green their transport choices are. We're pricing their options and they'll make those decisions in the most efficient manner. The ETS here is absolutely vital, but it's not about sort of engineering, say, mode shift. That's not really what I'm interested in this report. What I'm interested in is how can we create the most efficient transport system possible, and people will respond to the prices. We have an ETS framework that already prices these things.
So if I could come in here as an economist, I mean, we've got the Tinbergen rule. So you've got one policy objective, and therefore you have one tool to address that. So when it comes to climate change, we have an emissions trading scheme, and people are paying for that when they're filling their cars. And congestion is another policy objective, and for that we'll have road user charging, but you keep the two things separate. I mean, that's basically what you're proposing, right?
Yep, correct. And it's one of the nice benefits of having a good road charging system is that you do reduce congestion in urban centres, and that's good for noise pollution. It's good for emissions, but that's not the primary focus of well, it shouldn't be the primary focus of the transport system.
Okay. Here's a fun question for you. Will cyclists who use the roads, even bike lanes, also have to pay smart rug?
No, they're probably one of the exemptions. I said no, no exemption. I didn't actually think about cyclists, but potentially that's just because I'm a very bad cyclist myself.
Is that basically de minimis?
Yeah,
Yeah, because you're actually really charging by weight, and until you've got enough cyclists together to actually damage the road, it will take quite a while.
yeah, correct. You'd have to have a very, very heavy bike.
Okay, I haven't seen that kind of bike really. I think it really starts affecting road surfaces from about 3, 4 tons or so. I mean, everything under that is kind of marginal. It's all the same. It's when you get into the real big trucks and vans, that's when you start actually having an impact on the road itself.
Yeah,
So bikes, probably not.
yeah.
Okay, next one. It's hard for toll roads to cover their costs because free alternatives are always available. Would comprehensive pricing make tolled bills more viable? Well, actually, question's probably not quite correct because in your system, everything would be told, right? Effectively.
Well, you'd have a generalized system of pricing. I mean,
Yeah.
toll roads is one mechanism or kind of one weapon in the arsenal that you can
Yeah.
use. But it's probably important to stress that tolls serve a very specific purpose, and that's
Mhm.
to fund new infrastructure. And we're seeing the government look at this with the regional roads of significance, and they've got to weigh up whether there are merits there. There's a lot of debate around this, but I'm not taking a strong position. All I'm saying is that tolls are something that we should consider. It's a good concept. It can be worthwhile in certain contexts, but it's not a silver bullet, and so you've got to approach it case by case.
Okay. Um, then a political question for you. How do you avoid this becoming a revenue-raising mechanism?
Yeah, so you've got to avoid doing what London has done. There are other examples where this has happened. I'm a little bit concerned potentially around what might happen in Auckland, but you just have to be very clear about what is the purpose of congestion charging, and this is where I would distinguish it from toll roads. So toll roads are used to pay for new infrastructure. A congestion charge, if it's designed and implemented well, is about managing traffic throughput. That's all it is. It's not about generating money that you can then splash on bike lanes or new roads. That's not its core purpose.
Mhm.
And so congestion charging, if done that way, can be nested in a more broad road pricing scheme.
Okay. The next question is one we already touched upon in a previous one, I think. That's about efficient road use and fairness. Would it be, would it not be necessary to implement alongside other interventions such as better public transport cycling pathways? You said you didn't want to have that link really between public transport and road user charging. You wanted to keep them quite separate, right?
Yeah, I mean, good public transport obviously helps, but one of the problems that we've had in New Zealand in recent years are road users cross subsidizing users of public transport. So we're in a sort of process of recalibrating. So for the purposes of this report, I did want to keep them quite separate.
Okay. Next one, again about political acceptance. How do we get the public on board with road pricing? Merits are clear, but the public distrusts politicians around taxes and charges. Yep, we already talked about that. Is there a way to actually secure this institutionally?
I think it's going to come down to how successful the rollout of the congestion charging will be. I think the proof is going to be in the pudding, right? If you get that wrong, I think you can really shred any public appetite for a more sort of fulsome road pricing. And, there are good international examples here. So, Sydney, New South Wales is a great example. They've got a pretty dysfunctional toll road system. It's quite complex due to the nature of their PPP contracts, but it's totally shredded any public appetite for road pricing and specifically congestion charging. Um, New Zealand needs to learn that example, start small, show how congestion charging can work. And that way you can start building a story around this is actually beneficial for us and you can go from there. So I think that's got to be prime focus.
And that is the next question too, and that is public support for road pricing. What are the experiences from other cities? I mean, basically, that's what you would have to do. You would have to send your experts to Stockholm, Singapore, and other places, London maybe, and find out actually how did they convince their population to come on board with this
Yep.
new change.
Yep.
Actually, would send them probably also to places where it didn't work and learn from the lessons there. I mean, Germany is a perfect place where things really went wrong with road pricing. But if I understand you correctly, I mean, basically what you say, it's not so much a technical question. You really want to figure out how did they do their communications campaign.
Yep, correct. So you want to send people to where it worked, great, but just as important where it didn't go well. Example would be Edinburgh, whereas just a sort of spectacular failure. You have to study those examples and then really devise a good strategy in order to bring people along with you step by step.
Okay. Um, Another heavy economics question. Is it realistic to assume the welfare system can address equity issues given the dynamic nature of jobs, homes, and car use for low-income households? So I think if we just translate the question and make it a bit simpler, is road pricing something that works for people on lower incomes? Or will they be disadvantaged by the introduction of such a scheme? And how would you actually deal with that question?
Yeah. So the first thing I would say, just in terms of the wording of that question, is, this is a report about our road network. I'm not trying to solve inequality, not getting into the welfare system. That's, you know, Bryce or Eric or one of the economists in the team can do that. So very specific focus of how do we build the most efficient transport network. But to get to the sort of thrust of the question, there are a couple of things I'd say. Firstly, the current setup is not equitable. That's really important to recognize. Low income people pay disproportionately more per kilometre because they're driving less fuel efficient cars, much older cars. So it's not like we're in a nirvana now. The second point to add is that the international evidence raises some real concerns around this idea that road pricing is harmful for equity. Um, it, Based on my reading of this literature, that concern is more of a political comment rather than anything, grounded in empirical study. And then thirdly, there are ways to ameliorate this. So the Helen Clark Foundation, for instance, has done good work looking at how congestion charging and equity can go hand in hand. Our chief economist at the initiative, Eric Crampton, has looked at the idea of a congestion dividend. So that would be, people on low incomes can get a portion of their congestion charge back. There are all sorts of ways to ameliorate these concerns. But finally, I'd go back to my initial point. We're talking about a road network. That needs to be our focus. I think in the recent past, we've gotten a little bit distracted by other concerns and we've lost sight of what is a road network for? It's getting people from A to B most efficiently. We have other policy levers to pull if we want to get at issues of inequality.
Yeah, I saw that report from the Helen Clark Foundation. It's always nice to see the Helen Clark Foundation and the New Zealand Initiative agreeing on something. If we now include the Council of Trade Unions and the Taxpayers Union, I think we're all set. But maybe that's actually leading to the next question. There is a need to depoliticize this.
Yeah.
And there are too many politicians still who want to impose costs as sin taxes on practices that just don't match their preferences. How do you want to prevent this? So maybe translating the question once again, if you have a politician who really doesn't like private transport and private vehicles, there will always be a temptation to say, okay, let's just increase that road user charging just a little bit higher than it needs to be because we really don't want that. We want people to all use public transport and we'll use that as a tool.
Yeah, and this goes back to the point that the system currently is too politicized, right? So the minister, when they set out their GPS, which is a very political document, they have ample scope making these decisions. Now, it's always going to be the case around the margins that, say you have a Green and Labour government, there's probably going to be a little bit more emphasis on public transport and the like. Likewise, national government, probably a few more big roads, etc. Now, that's okay if it's around the margins, but when it's really dominant and the current setup caters to that, you get these big swings between successive governments, and we don't get that stability over the long term. And that's where in this report I intimate in the sort of medium to long term, I think we really do need to think about a structural reset. So you're making these decisions independently, and it's not the Minister of Transport.
Mhm. I see. There's a techie question. I wonder whether I should try that. Someone says here, well, GPS is available everywhere. I mean, yeah, it's a global positioning system, but the devices still need to get online somehow to send the data. Is the mobile network ready for this? And I just have this picture in my mind that someone is driving on some countryside roads and deliberately stays in mobile phone black spots just so it will never be able to transmit the data and pay. But I think that can be overcome because actually our coverage is pretty good, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. I should probably, I am a historian. I'm not a technologist, so this is not my strong suit. But in my discussions with industry leaders here, again, this is not a problem. They have ways of going about this. So I don't think it would sort of derail the scheme. There are solutions there.
Yeah, no, I'm just an economist. I'm not a tech expert either. But I'm just thinking that currently One New Zealand, so previously Vodafone, is rolling out satellite-based communication, actually, at least for text services nationwide, with no more black spots anywhere in the country. So I think this probably shouldn't be such a big technical obstacle to overcome. But anyway, we're speculating here. We should ask the experts. Next question. Cycle lanes still occupy space. It's not just about mass. The cyclists should pay for the benefit they enjoy and the cost of the to the rest of us they incur. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have very strong views on this. Partly because I find this kind of discussion pitting road users, so drivers versus cyclists, you do sort of descend into a bit of a culture war. I don't necessarily think that's helpful. I think there are sort of bigger issues at stake. So yeah, not the putting a road user charge or a cyclist user charge was not my core focus.
Okay, I think we'll probably leave that here. Next question, and I recognize the name as my old friend Peter Seaton from Australia. She says it's a good idea, and she mentions that in a book that I think I actually contributed a chapter to some time ago, there was an Australian politician by the name of Paul Fletcher who mused on a pro rata road access allocation where individuals can trade and price their access to the roads. I mean, that's a fancy idea. What do you think?
I think that's one for you, Oliver, as the economist.
I like cap and trade schemes, but I just wonder how complicated that would be to
Yeah, I mean, my immediate inclination is, okay, that sounds quite interesting, but it probably wouldn't be the primary focus. I think the change, the plan for reform is significant enough. Um, so you could probably add that later on. Let's get the basics right first.
So let's just say to Peter Seaton, you try this in New South Wales. If it works, we'll copy it. Um, what do you think of what the government has already said about road pricing? Now getting onto the practicalities. I mean, we haven't really got much detail from the Transport Minister, from Simeon Brown. We know they are going to do it. I think he's given a couple of speeches about it, but we haven't really seen the finer detail of the proposal yet, have we?
No, what I've seen has been encouraging, specifically around congestion charging and tolling. And my sense is they're working through this right now. In terms of the broader picture, the detail hasn't been forthcoming, but I don't see that as a concern, right? The discussions are happening, people are working on this. It's not an easy thing to implement. Um, So I think we just need to wait and see.
Okay. The next one is not even a question, but someone reminding us, and I would have done that anyway, that your report is, of course, available on our website at nzinitiative.org.nz. You can all download it from the website, and this is what it looks like. Um, but next question here is actually about the cost of the onboard units. So probably a cost of between $100 and $200 per vehicle times 3 million vehicles. So that's quite a lot of money. And the question is, has there been a cost benefit study done on this?
Not that I'm aware of. Um, and I would imagine that, you talk about we've not heard the detail forthcoming from the Minister of Transport yet. I would imagine that that's part of the process that they're working through right now.
Hmm. Okay. Next one. particularly given our poor understanding of the ETS in New Zealand, will this not likely lead to governments increasing road prices aiming to reduce transport emissions?
Um, Not necessarily. I don't see why that would be the case.
Oh, wow. You can all, well, I think we can all imagine politicians who really don't understand quite how the ETS works. And then they will look at road prices and say, well, actually, if we really want to reduce emissions, let's just increase our tolls and our road prices and smart trucks or whatever you call them in the future, because this will drive down emissions because people will drive less.
Yeah, but I think that is tapping back into the sort of consistent theme of we want to make this independent, right, and remove the lever from the politicians. That's the sort of big bogey in the background.
Well, you want to make this bulletproof, but actually, if I could add, you probably also have to make the ETS itself bulletproof because we have seen a lot of politicization with climate policy in the
Yep,
last few
yep.
years. Okay, now complex questions, but we touched on this before. Should tolls be more about CapEx and RUCs be more about OpEx? What do you think?
Yes, I do think that that's the case. I think tolls are most valuable when we're talking about investing in new infrastructure. And then the sort of more general road pricing scheme is about, core maintenance, right? That's really at the root of our big problem. So I agree with the sort of premise of this.
But correct me if I'm wrong, you could, once you have a comprehensive scheme set up, actually fold the tolls into the general payment system.
Yeah, but I think you have to be very clear while you're sort of pulling a lever on a specific toll road, right? And that serves its
Yeah.
purpose, much like congestion charging serves its purpose. And so they complement that
Yeah.
general road pricing scheme. But I think, yeah, really important to
People
have.
wouldn't need a separate account. You could probably all do this
Yeah,
on.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. But it's having clarity over what levers you're pulling and why.
Okay, cool. Um, And I think that basically answers the next question we have here, and that's about toll roads. You're saying that toll roads would coexist with congestion charging. Absolutely. Similar kind of system, just different purposes. And would people be paying twice to travel the same stretch of road? Well, probably not, would they?
No, no.
No. Okay. Next question specifically about holidays, and we are in school holidays right now. So city exodus for public holidays often causes congestion where it doesn't exist otherwise. How will the system address such?
Yeah, so in those instances, you wouldn't have a sort of formal congestion charging, but if you have a universal road pricing scheme that's, managing demand, then you would be paying a little bit more when you're traveling through areas that are really congested at, specific times. So it's just a more flexible system that can actually adapt to that exact scenario that you've spelled out.
Well, you could actually charge more for public holidays when everybody wants to get out of Auckland or out of Wellington. In a way, we're doing that already with demerit points, for example. You announce that actually, sorry, it's a holiday coming up and there's double demerit points. So we've had
Hmm.
that before. So why couldn't you actually adjust your charging then for those times when we all know that the roads are going to clock up anyway?
Yeah, but I mean, these are all the options that you have, and
Okay,
that's the sort of benefit of the model.
righto. I think we might have time for maybe just one or two questions. Would users receive easily digestible reporting about what costs they're incurring so that they can readily understand what their choices are?
Ideally, yes. In the model that I've outlined, you'd want a range of providers offering services to road users. So the incentives there for the private operators to offer a service that road users like. And I would imagine road users quite like to see the breakdown of their costs and the service that they're receiving. So you'd hope you'd have a marketplace for that. You'd get that innovation, and that competition would spur that sort of product.
Okay. Probably the last question we could take. But can I just say to all of you online, actually, thank you for staying with us, actually, and congratulations, Matthew. You kept the audience alive with a very complicated and sometimes technical issue. We couldn't take all the questions. There are more on Slido, but please feel free to email us or actually email Matthew directly, any questions you may still have. But in the meantime, I can just recommend you read the report. As I said, it's on the website. It's called Driving Change, How Road Pricing Can Improve Our Roads. Hopefully you will find all your questions answered. And for the remaining questions you still have, there's always Simeon Brown who will give us his road pricing vision, hopefully within this current quarter, at least that was in the government's Q3 plan. But for now, thank you, Matthew. Congratulations on the report. It's an extremely well-written report. It's very informative, and I think it will hopefully inform the debate that we're all going to have together with our government on the future of road pricing. Thank you all for tuning in, and we look forward to seeing you again next time. But for now, thanks again. Thanks, Matthew, and bye-bye.
Yes.